Greetings, everybody, from your Michigan Conference Minister. I'm Lillian Daniel, and I'm glad to see all of you here. Let us begin with prayer. Gracious God, we ask that you bless our time together. We acknowledge that we all bring heavy burdens into this space, that we have lists of things to do, that we could have done other things in this moment other than be together as the body of Christ. And so we place all those items on our list, our worries and concerns, on the everlasting arms of Jesus as we breathe in and open our hearts to your holy presence. In Christ's name, amen. It is good to see members and pastors of our Michigan Conference United Church of Christ showing up on the screen, as well as friends from other denominations. Introduce yourselves in the chat so we know who you are. And I'm delighted today to be talking about the topic of positive patriotism. This is something that comes up for us in our churches, in our personal lives, around holidays like Memorial Day, Veterans Day, July the 4th. What do we do with these in the life of the church? Obviously, none of them are mentioned by Jesus, but we live in a context and a culture where these things are going on. How do we acknowledge veterans? How do we talk about war? These are all the things that pastors have to contend with. How do we pray about these things? And how do we contend with the prayer requests that we are given? Sometimes in wording that is perhaps not the wording we would use ourselves. And how do you negotiate that as a church? So different churches have different traditions around this. And I've been at all of them, but I was thinking about the question of the flags in church is something that I think everyone's got a story about. And I feel like I've got a story about them from various churches. But I remember a story told by a very experienced interim minister who had done many churches. And he said that this happened so often to him that he would go to a church, and if the church, the previous minister, under that person's leadership, if they had removed the American flag from the front of the sanctuary, upon his first Sunday, he would discover it had been discovered and replaced, or vice versa. If the flag had already was there, vice versa, right? And he talked about how often in his work as an interim minister that question would come up. And so you'll see behind me that in my office here at home, I have mementos of my family. And to this side of me, I don't know if you can see it, but my father was a war correspondent. He was a journalist overseas. And that is his portable typewriter that he used when he was a reporter covering the Vietnam War. So that was essentially high tech. That was a laptop. It has a little broken leather case, and he would carry that around with him and be literally trying to type on pieces of paper, in the foxholes in the Vietnam War. And before that, many years before that, he served in the Korean War as a Marine. And he was one of those people for whom his life was changed and radically improved, and he was able to receive opportunities for education through that service. And he shared with me that when he joined as Marine from Knoxville, Tennessee, he did so out of a spirit of patriotism, but also wanting to see the world. But later, when he became a journalist, he covered the civil rights movement. And then later, the big story was the Vietnam War. And he wanted to go and cover that. And he talked about how he went over there with that same, if you would, youthful patriotism and enthusiasm that he had that had made him join the Marine Corps. And that during the course, though, of covering the Vietnam War for all those years, his feelings changed around how he felt about his country in that conflict and in that moment. But what did not change for him was his desire to honor the sacrifice of those who had fought. And he, in his reporting, often told stories of what he said back then they called the grunts. It was the people on the ground, the soldiers, and not just the American soldiers, but also the other side. And when my father died, unfortunately, both my parents died pretty young, but when my father died, it was 20 years ago. In his little shoebox of stuff, his will, his bills, his retirement account, was an envelope that we were shocked to discover indicated that he was to be buried, all expenses paid at Arlington National Cemetery, because as it turns out, he had a Purple Heart from his time in the Korean War. And when he was buried, and many of you experienced this, the flag over here was folded ceremonially and presented. And I was the family member who received it. And I keep it in my church offices ever since, even though I remember his own feelings being complex around his own country and patriotism, and yet his pride that his funeral service was covered by that. And so the flag, I have it here. Usually it's kind of on a shelf over here, but I have it here today just to start us off in this conversation, to sort of acknowledge that we all bring a complexity of experiences and family history to this topic. And we're going to have two presentations today. Andrew Warner, who is our Director of Finance and also helps us with generosity. He's not going to be talking about those subjects. He's going to be talking from a pastor's heart about some of the hymns that we choose to sing and what they mean around patriotism. And then Lawrence Richardson, our Associate Conference Minister of Church Vitality, is going to be talking to us about the flag and some reflections on that. And then we really want to open it up to all of you and have a free-flowing conversation about how we navigate these waters. So with that, I will turn it over to Reverend Andrew Warner.
Thank you, Lillian, and it's great to join you today in this conversation. As I think about this question of patriotism, I'm mindful that I'm doing so from my home in Wisconsin. I live beside the Menominee Nation. The Menominee Nation lives on its ancestral tribal communities that does so, of course, and I'm actually not far from the spot where the Menominee refused to leave. The military at one point was trying to march them to Minnesota. They got a little bit down the road, and then they just simply refused to move 130 years ago. And so because of that decision, which was, of course, quite dangerous, they've remained. And I think about them now in times when I struggle with my own relationship with my country, to think about what does it mean to stay and to be part of, to stay in place. The Menominee, of course, like many tribal nations, have very high rates of participation in the military. And so I go to Menominee events and you see all of the veterans of a people, of a nation who have been made to feel like they don't belong and have their land stolen. And it speaks to me some of the complexity of what it means to be a patriot in this moment. And some of the complexity that I experienced as a gay man living in America. My husband served in the Navy, and yet our status has politically always been a question in America. So I approach this question of patriotism from that confusing place of belonging and not belonging, of staying and wanting to leave, all at the same time. But today I want to think with you about a couple of the songs that we sing patriotically. The first of those, the oldest, is My Country 'Tis of Thee. I'm not a singer. I'm not going to sing that for you. But that was written by a congregational minister. And I think it speaks to the way in which religion and patriotism are often intertwined in ways that can seem very problematic. And yet there is this way in which we have a long history of people of deep faith being proud to be American and singing about it. So that song, of course, is My Country 'Tis of Thee, Sweet Land of Liberty. Of thee I sing, land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. Just 10 or 15 years after that hymn was composed and had started to be sung in churches across America, another abolitionist wrote a version of that really, I think, points to what I experience patriotism is. So this abolitionist revision of the song said, My country, 'tis of thee, stronghold of slavery, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, where men's rights deride, from every mountainside thy deeds shall ring. I think those two versions of the same song speak to the way in which patriotism is challenging, about how it can be both pride, but also a call to confession. And these multiple tensions that can exist in our national hymns. The one, though, where I think it most comes to the fore for me is in the national anthem that Francis Scott Key wrote during the war in 18 the War of 1812. So he wrote it in 1814 while imprisoned on a British frigate watching the bombardment of Baltimore. One, I just think it's really interesting to think about, how does a person in prison think about America? And that's not the view that we typically take when we talk about patriotism. What does that view of imprisonment say about America? One of the things that stands out is that the national anthem is full of questions. We don't normally think of it that way. We think of the high impossible notes to reach and how no one really knows the words. But really, when we pay attention to the words of it, it's full of questions. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave? It's a question, and that invites me to think of my patriotism as a question, not as an American dream, not as an American proclamation, not as an American declaration, but as an American question. And that fundamental to my patriotism is a sense of questioning. And those questions really give the pace of the song and move it along. And that's what I want to claim. It's a question. Now, Francis Scott Key is asking questions that he really doesn't know the answer to. Asking, does the banner yet wave? When it's not clear to him that that's the case, that it's not clear to him that the Americans will survive the night. But also, I think it's what I find intriguing and important to think about with the anthem is the troubled history of it. Francis Scott Key was an enslaver. He supported slavery. He was part of the racist structure of America. And the third verse, which we often completely skip over in the anthem, is written from an enslaver's point of view. Where I think, though, that sorry, let me find but I want to just say that singing the anthem then as a question says that it's not self-evident how these questions will be answered. And so when one of the stanzas says, "What is that which the breeze over the towering steep, as it faithfully blows, half conceals, half discloses?" To me, that again speaks to this moment of patriotism where there are things that are both concealed and disclosed. There are things about our racist past, there are things about our present, our future that are not clear and self-evident, but through questioning, through a questioning patriotism, that's what I want to work to finding answers to in our day. And I'll turn over to my good colleague, Lawrence Richardson, to carry us further.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today. I've served in so many different contexts over the last 21 years. And whether they were conservative, liberal, or progressive churches, or predominantly white, predominantly black, or mixed race churches, the presence of the flag means something different for everyone. And for those who have a strong tie to their founding legacies, the flag represents not only pride, but it represents progress. It is a stake in the ground. It's a claim that this is our home, if you will. It's an acknowledgement that wherever the peoples came from, that this land is their home. For immigrant communities, especially our churches that were evangelical, reformed, that originally spoke German or came here from a European country where they needed to show their allegiance to America, especially during the First and the Second World Wars. The flag in the sanctuary represents certainly pride and certainly claiming this as their home, but it also represents allegiance to America, the American government, that they're denouncing anything that would be in opposition to the American government. So there is a layer of complexity when we think about that. For the formerly enslaved folks and for the descendants, the American descendants of enslaved people, the American flag represents just as much nuance. It is a claim that this is, in fact, our home, that while many folks were taken from their lands of origin, perhaps lost stories of where their families might have come from. Uh, the American flag represents a beginning. It represents identity. It represents the fact that this land was built with the blood, sweat, tears, and prayers of enslaved and formerly enslaved folks. And so those people were people. And in fact, this is their country. They built it. And so the flag is a symbol of pride. It's a symbol that this is our home. And one of the things that I lift up is the poem by Langston Hughes called Let America Be America Again, because I think it symbolizes that nuance and the complexity of claiming a symbol for a land that has a complex history and still finding meaning in this place. And so I'm just going to read a small excerpt, and then I'm going to turn it back over to our conference minister. And thank you, Jen, for putting the link to the poem in the chat, because then you all can read the entire poem at your leisure. But I'm just going to read this brief snippet from the beginning and then a snippet from the end that I believe really truly captures how African American descendants of enslaved people, especially, and many folks from immigrant communities, can find hope in a symbol and in a nation that has a problematic history. So here's an excerpt from Let America Be America Again. I am the poor white, fooled and pushed apart. I am the Negro bearing slavery's scars. I am the red man driven from the land. I am the immigrant clutching the hope I seek and finding only the same stupid plan. I say it plain. America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath. America will be. Out of the rack and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot of graft and stealth and lies, we the people must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plain. All, the stretch of these great green states, and make America again. That's my excerpt. And for me, that symbolizes the acknowledgement that there is complexity, there is nuance in history that we cannot skip past, that we must acknowledge. There are rights that we must wrong and reconciliation that must happen. And yet we can still have pride in the place that we have planted our homes, hopes, and dreams and families. And we can live from a place of hopefulness and pride in our land that we have created together.
That's a powerful poem, Lawrence. And I think we're sort of taking it in too. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And I was just going to add this one thing, which was, we've just had Memorial Day come and go. And I'm always curious as to what churches do with that, et cetera. But also, it can be a time when the experience gap between families who have had people in the service and people who haven't really gets shown, because sometimes people will get definitions wrong and won't recognize, for example, Memorial Day is when we recognize people whose lives have been lost. Veterans Day is different, right? But I was going to share with you a devotional I wrote for the UCC years back, just to open our conversation, and it's called Memorial Day. I'll put a link in there. But the psalm I used was, "My hands are in your hand. Deliver me from the hand of my enemies and persecutors. Let your face shine upon your servant. Save me in your steadfast love," from Psalm 31. And then I say, Memorial Day began after the Civil War as an effort toward reconciliation between the families of veterans in the North and the South. After the war, there was already a tradition in the North of decorating soldiers' graves called Decoration Day. But in 1868, an organization of Northern War veterans decreed it to be a national holiday. So May 30th was carefully chosen as the date, actually because it was not the anniversary of a specific battle and therefore would be a neutral date for both sides, although legend has it was also selected because the flowers would be available then. But human beings, we hold on to the wounds, and reconciliation, as we all know, takes time, grace, and mercy. So initially, as this holiday spread, it was an occasion for both sides to actually give angry speeches about the wartime atrocities inflicted by the other side and the righteousness of their own. So it didn't unfold the way they hoped. But as time went on, Memorial Day really did become a time to remember all veterans whose lives have been lost, a time to visit the graves of family and friends and ancestors and to remember their lives. And in 1968, the Uniform Holidays Bill moved 3 holidays off of their specific dates and onto Mondays in order to create the 3-day weekend. And Memorial Day came to be associated with the beginning of summer, as well as the Indianapolis 500 and going shopping, etc. But I think, when it comes to Memorial Day and these holidays, it's important to remember the spirit in which the day was conceived, particularly this one, as a way to bring together those who had once been bitter enemies. And after the fighting is over, to remember that the loss and the heartbreak are shared throughout the entire human family. And God's mercy pours out over all God's children with no respect for the borders of nation states, which are very temporary from the perspective of eternity. So for me, Memorial Day is a time when I pray for comfort for anybody who has lost somebody to the ravages of war. And I always pray for the peace of Christ that passes all human understanding and respects no borders. So with that, I want to open it up for your conversation, and maybe even if some of you want to comment, what do you do with Memorial Day, or how is it handled in the church you're in? And I see Jonathan Riedel has his hand up already.
This is one of those occasions where the ambivalence of my own family of origin is very, very much in play. I was raised in an immigrant church, the German Evangelical Reformed Church, which was still all my direct ancestors came from Germany after the Civil War. So we did not participate in the Great Patriotic Spring. And for many years, my church still spoke German in their worship services until the eve of World War I, when we got the power shut off of our church because the city of Wyandotte, Michigan didn't like the fact that we were speaking German. The reality is we switched over to English very quickly after that point. Half of my family has been dedicated in the military, the other half has been determined pacifists, both over the Vietnam War era. My maternal grandfather suffered from an extreme example of PTSD from his experience during World War II, and it led to later mental illness on his part, which affected my family very negatively. So I approach these holidays with a tremendous ambivalence. And ambivalence that has never been shared by the congregations I have served, and therefore I have to really step lightly. One of the ways that I have dealt with this is I know many of you recognize the members of the congregation who have died during All Saints' Day. We do it on Memorial Day. Because at that point, we recognize just the veterans, but we recognize the importance of everyone who had died in that year and the impact, whether they served our country in the military or whether they served the country in many other phenomena. The other experience I can relate to right now about the ambivalence of Memorial Day. Like my first church in South Dakota, I was asked to do a Memorial Day service at the local cemetery. And I did a sermon, basically a very short service, praying for everlasting peace, but honoring those who had given their lives. And I noticed that one of my parishioners was extremely angry about the whole thing. I thought it was something I had said, so I spoke with him privately afterwards, asking plainly if I had said something to offend him. He said, "You are fine, Pastor. It's the other people who are here. They drive me nuts. They bought off, all these people who are here bought off their service to America by drafting Native Americans in their place. I am the only one that actually served the military, and yet these people are the most patriotic people I know."
Mm.
So this is the ambivalence that I end up feeling about these holidays is one person's patriotism is another person's blasphemy. And how I don't have the answer of how to balance those things.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's a profound story. Thank you. It takes me to the poem. Makes me think of the poem that Lord read. Pastor Eric in Chelsea, you would like to share?
Yeah, well, it's just that Memorial Day, patriotism, and grief are so intertwined, such a part of the DNA of our congregation. So I look out daily out my office window, and I look at a Gold Star Memorial that is on our grounds in memory of Captain Joel Gentz, who was killed in action in Afghanistan June 9th, 2010. So it'll be 15 years ago. He was 25. He was raised in the church, Sunday school, youth group. And it's been my understanding that when that happened, the impact obviously on Steve and Judy, his mom and dad, and his siblings, but on the church was so profound, and journeying through that grief together was such it was such a spiritual encounter for this entire congregation that it has just become a part of the DNA of this church. And so people will come from all over Chelsea to just visit that memorial and acknowledge who Joel was, and what his death represents. And we have a lot of conversations about grace around Joel's death. Judy, his mom, is very involved in a lot of Gold Star Mother initiatives, and she talks about her journey towards forgiving the people who shot rockets at Joel's helicopter and ultimately led to his death. And it's so we talk about Memorial Day, and we talk about military service and grief in this church a lot. I've learned from the Gentz family that we don't do liturgy around Memorial Day, but during Joys and Concerns, we always spend careful, intentional time. We talk about Joel, but we also talk about the grief that people who have lost family members to service in the U.S. military experience and carry, but also the grief carried by those around the world who have lost loved ones because of our war efforts. We talk about Iraqi families and Afghani families, and grief around the world. And grief connected to war is inescapable, and it's patriotic to acknowledge that, and it's patriotic to take responsibility as a country. And we ought not confuse patriotism and nationalism, right? Nationalism is being supportive of those efforts no matter what, and not asking questions. And it's patriotism is a journey of accountability too. So we talk a lot about patriotism in this church, and what it means and how complicated it is, and how it manifests as love of neighbor, and not necessarily unwavering devotion to government and country. Patriotism isn't bootlicking. It's love of neighbor is how we talk about it around here. So if you're ever in Chelsea, if you're visiting St. Paul, pay a visit to the memorial. It will move you. There's a lot of good stories behind who Joel was, and what it all means to our congregation and our community now. So Chelsea as a town, does Memorial Day in a way I've never experienced before in my life. It's the appropriate, to me anyways, level of somber. There's a I don't know. You'd have to experience to know what I mean. So
And it's
yeah,
also, I think, Eric, I mean, it's also like so much of it is generational, right? And when it's somebody
sure.
closer to our generation, it hits us. But those memorial plaques were somebody else's 25-year-old friend
Yep.
or
Yep.
some, it's the power that is amazing. And I think also with, Afghanistan is a really interesting example that we are still processing that conflict. I
Oh
think,
yeah.
historians will be as we have with Vietnam.
Yep.
And how is the grief more complicated or less complicated depending on how history evaluates the war
Yep.
as a moral cause or as a success or however we define it. And I think Cynthia had a comment about Vietnam vets in the chat. I may come back to you, Cynthia, but I see Brian Smilde, you have your hand up from Rockford.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Lillian. So in 2004, my family and I immigrated from Canada to Grand Rapids to pastor a church. And my very first Memorial Day service, or well, Sunday worship service on Memorial Day weekend, um, also coincided with Pentecost that year. And during that worship service, we did nothing for Pentecost. We had a special prayer for Memorial Day. We sang a patriotic hymn, and we displayed a slideshow featuring those who had died and doing a special tribute that way. The next day, oh no, 2 days later, so on the Tuesday, a man in my church came to me to confront me that we didn't do appropriate reverence for Memorial Day on that Sunday during worship. And because I didn't, I, as the pastor, was communicating to the congregation that I'm anti-war and I'm anti the current president at that time.
Mm. Was it
And
true?
nothing was spoken about Pentecost, that we completely overlooked Pentecost so we could intentionally do something for Memorial Day. And whatever we did was still not enough.
That's an amazing story. And do you feel, Brian, that as a pastor who had come from another country, do you think you were under a heavier scrutiny yourself as an immigrant, or would they have had that scrutiny of anybody?
I don't know. I didn't know how to respond to him. And then I told some of my friends who are American pastors, and they're like, I would have said da 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 to him. And I'm like, okay, that's great for you. You're American. And I couldn't. And I was just kind of blown away. Like we devoted significant time, and for him it wasn't enough. And his interpretation of that was I'm anti-war and anti the president. And so that was my first experience of coming into America and experiencing an American holiday, and it was very confusing at best. That this is patriotism, like this is what we need to do on a Sunday morning during worship. Memorial Day is a Monday. It is not on the Sunday, and Sunday is about resurrection, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ on Sundays. And so I was just blown away. And so yeah, I stayed at that church, and every year we did something, but I guess it was never enough. And so I'm grateful I'm at a church now that does virtually nothing on Memorial Day Sunday, because Sunday it's about resurrection. It's not about Memorial Day. If you want a Memorial Day work experience in some kind of service, that's a civic thing. That's not a church thing.
That's so
my
you're definitely representing a theological position that I'm familiar with. It's almost coming out of the Stanley Hauerwas and that the church does the church's work and you don't do the nation state's work. But for me, the gray area is always the pastoral prayers, because that is where we bring in our what's happening in the world. I was never as much of a hardliner as you know, as that, Brian, but that's a respected theological position within the church that has always been struggled with. Rick Dykema, I see your hand is up from Ada. Unmute.
Hello, everyone from rainy Ada. Yeah, I also have found Hauerwas and Anabaptists coming from a Dutch Reformed tradition. I find much more meaning, or well, different meaning, but valuable meaning from Hauerwas and others. And so our church has an American flag on this huge pole right as you drive in, and right to the, if you're standing in the pulpit, there was always a American flag right here. And we would take it down for weddings because they didn't want it in the pictures. And then I would be told to put it back as the associate pastor. You do all the grunt work. And I never put it back up. It was like a quiet protest. And so it would stay in the choir room for a bunch of weeks until somebody decided they were going to move it. And one of those times it lasted about 6 months, which I was happy with. And then once we transitioned, the previous pastor left. And I, in the search process, I was a bridge pastor, and then COVID hit. And so we took it out of, I noticed, the picture at the back of our slides in the songs had that flag right there. And after 2 weeks, I was like, we need to retake those pictures for the backgrounds. And it has never gone back in. We now have the flag. We have a little historical cabinet with the original silver going back 175 years, communion set, that sort of thing. And the flag is over there. But the first year I did Memorial Day, Pastor Rebecca and I, we had this beautiful service around the word remember. The entire thing, and multiple stations and multi-sensory. It was one of the most, she's incredible at planning meaningful worship experiences. And the previous pastor was gone. And so she was able to kind of go nuts and freely plan. And we got done, and I thought it was one of the most beautiful things we had ever done. But I could tell one person was really angry. And often people will stay seated during the postlude, but she followed me right down the aisle as I went out, and she met me at the door, and she was this close to my face, and she was yelling to where everybody was turning around as they listened to the postlude. And she was just going off. And we had mentioned troops. We had prayed for the fallen. The whole thing was about remember, not just remember, how great America is, but remembering our faith. And it was beautiful. But she just went off. And then I'm trying to figure out, again, Gary had retired less than 1 month earlier. So, how do I handle this as I'm not the official pastor? But man, she was bringing it. And it was public, and everybody could hear it. And then I was trying to figure out, how am I going to respond? I invited her to meet with me after. I'd love to talk with you. I was trying to encourage us to walk outside together, so at least it wasn't right there next to a worship sanctuary. And eventually she screamed, "Whatever happened to God and country?" And thankfully she turned and stormed off at that point, because I would have responded. I was ready to respond. I couldn't hold it back anymore. I was going to say God and country is at the root of much, much evil that has happened in our world, including right now. And I didn't have the opportunity to say that because she stormed off. But that was the most, after wrestling with it for decades, that's such a seminal moment of, we have this beautiful service honoring memory, including honoring fallen troops. Whatever happened to God and country? Like Brian said, it wasn't enough. What we did was never going to be enough.
Well, I think it's become one of these litmus test issues that people walk in to say you're either going to pass or fail this test, and you're probably going to flunk it. It's got that baggage, and I do see some great comments here. Oh, Jason Dillingham, please do jump in. He's talking about the fact that he is himself a veteran and where he stands on this. And EJ, I hope we can get you next. But Jason, go ahead.
Hi. Sorry, I'm allergic to hero worship, so I tend to not like push this information forward, but I did receive a commendation for valor in the First Persian Gulf War. Served at the Battle of 73 Easting with 3rd Armor Division, and when I came back and I was called into the ministry, my vow to the country was replaced by a vow to Jesus. And I'm familiar with all the historical background about how flags in the sanctuary are the result of the fear that German Christians were not loyal to our country. So I bring up that history. I also am aware of, the Anabaptist tradition, if you will. I will say humorously that one of the least wise decisions I ever made as a pastor was on the Sunday of July 4th. I decided to play a video of a poem called The War Prayer,
Yeah.
which went over like a lead balloon with some people. But I felt as a veteran and a soldier, we're the ones who have experienced it. And very often we're the ones who, if you really sit down and talk to us, would have an objection to the romanticism of war and the hero worship that goes along with it. And really the civic religion that tries to infiltrate Christianity, using the language of Christianity and yet having its own creed and its own holy places and its own, religious symbols that really have nothing to do with Jesus. So I guess in that place, I have the advantage that I can have those conversations and I don't have to feel like I earned my right to say what I need to say. And so I also feel the responsibility to say those things because I can offer, I guess I can offer a counter to the toxic nationalism, and reframe it, in the voice of a pastor. So
That's very powerful, Jason. And I do think there's an authority with which a veteran can speak or even take a risk like that, that is very deep. I remember my father, covering various wars, went on to cover Middle East and, sort of every struggle. And he observed as a journalist what I'm hearing some of you reflect on in your churches, which is that often the person who gets most upset about what you didn't do enough on for Memorial Day or July the 4th is not the veteran. It's somebody who has not been touched by that in the same way. And those are the people who tend to be the loudest on these things, as some of you all have reflected. Pastor EJ, are you still on? Do you want to say a word? Oh, EJ may have had to head out. Hungry children. Okay. So Cynthia, did you want to reflect a little bit about your comment in which you talked about working with Vietnam vets? And unmute. Are you able to unmute, Cynthia? Rats, we can't hear you. Well, if you do figure it out, holler at us. It's usually just clicking that little picture of the microphone in the bottom left. Yeah. Okay. Others who want to weigh in, we've had some comments in the chat about Christian nationalism versus patriotism. Does anyone want to take a stab at teasing out a little bit of the difference, and then we will Oh no, you know what? We are not going to get into that right now because it is time for our prayer. And but if you stay on and chat about that, you may, but it's past the 12:45 mark. So let us pray. May the peace of Christ that truly passes all human understanding fill your hearts and minds and bodies, and be with all of our nations and those who govern. That mysterious peace of Christ be the peace that rules the world. In the name of the Prince of Peace, we pray, Amen.